I just do what I instinctively feel I want to do. And I'm lucky to have that opportunity and that privilege to do that. I'm also helped by some.
There was a time when music didn't just play in the background, it stayed with you. It lingered in quiet rooms, in late-night drives, in the soft glow of a radio that never quite felt alone. And in those moments, certain voices didn't just entertain. They defined an era. Sting was one of those voices. Not the loudest, not the wildest, but perhaps the most controlled. The kind of presence that didn't demand attention, yet somehow held it completely. But the story behind that voice was never as calm as it sounded. Because while the world heard precision melody and unmistakable clarity behind the scenes, there was something else unfolding, something far more complicated. Success, especially the kind that lasts, is rarely built on agreement. It comes from tension, from differences that refuse to settle, from people who see the same path and insist on walking it in completely different ways. When the police rose to prominence, they didn't just sound different, they felt different. There was an edge beneath the music, something tight, almost restrained, as if at any moment it could break loose. And in many ways, it nearly did. Because the band wasn't built on harmony between its members, it was built on contrast. Strong personalities, sharp minds, and an unwillingness to step aside. And at the center of it all stood Sting, holding a vision that not everyone was willing to follow. What the audience never saw were the moments between the songs, the disagreements that stretched longer than the music itself, the silence that followed arguments no one wanted to finish, and the growing realization that success was pulling them apart just as much as it was lifting them up. This is not just the story of a musician. It is the story of pressure control and the quiet battles that shape something unforgettable. And as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the shadows behind it. Sting was born Gordon Matthew Thomas Sumner on the 2nd of October 1951 in Wallsend, Northumberland, England, a place where life moved to the rhythm of industry, not ambition. The shipyards dominated everything. Steel smoke and the slow movement of massive vessels drifting down the River Tyne were part of everyday life. As a boy, Sting would stand and watch those ships disappear into the distance, carrying with them a quiet sense of escape. It was a simple image, but one that stayed with him, a reminder that there was always something beyond what he could see. Before the world knew his name, before the stages and the lights, he lived a life built on discipline. He was a teacher, structured, thoughtful, and far removed from the chaos that would later define his career. But music had already taken hold, pulling him in a direction that felt uncertain yet impossible to ignore. When he joined forces with Stewart Copeland and Andy Summers to form the Police, it didn't begin as a smooth partnership. It was three individuals, each with a different understanding of what the music should become. Sting quickly emerged as the central voice, the songwriter, the image, the direction, but leadership came with tension. The more clearly he defined the path forward, the more resistance he faced from those who believed their voice mattered just as much. And they weren't wrong. That was the foundation of everything that followed. Because this was never a story about one man rising alone. It was about three strong identities forced into the same space, each unwilling to disappear. And as the music grew stronger, so did the pressure behind it. What started as collaboration slowly became negotiation, and then something far more difficult to manage. Because in a band where everyone believed they were essential, control was never something given freely. It had to be taken, held, and defended at every step. Number 5. Stewart Copeland. Stewart Copeland didn't just join the Police. In many ways, he built the foundation that allowed it to exist in the first place. He had the drive, the connections, the urgency to make something happen when nothing was guaranteed. From the outside, it might have looked like a partnership, but inside the band it quickly became something far more complicated. Copeland was energy, fast, aggressive, always pushing forward. His drumming wasn't simply about keeping time. It was about challenging it, stretching it, forcing the music to move in ways that felt alive. And in the early days, that energy gave the Police their edge. It made them stand out in a crowded, restless music scene that was constantly searching for something new. But energy without alignment can only hold together for so long. Because standing across from him was Sting, measured, precise, and increasingly certain about the direction the band should take. Sting wasn't chasing noise. He was shaping structure. Every lyric had intention. Every arrangement had a purpose. And the clearer that vision became, the less space there was for anything that didn't fit within it. At first, the disagreements felt almost necessary. A pushed tempo here, a resisted idea there. Small clashes that seemed to sharpen the music rather than break it. But inside a room filled with strong personalities, those moments didn't disappear, they accumulated. Studio sessions became longer, heavier, filled with pauses that carried more weight than words. Copeland didn't hide his frustration. He challenged openly, directly, often refusing to back down. Sting responded differently, not louder but firmer. He would hold his position, refine his argument, and wait until the room shifted in his direction. And over time, that difference in approach created something deeper than disagreement. It created distance. On stage, they still moved as one. The performances were tight, electric, undeniable. But behind the music, the connection was beginning to fracture. Because when two people believe they are essential and neither is willing to step aside, conflict doesn't fade, it settles in. And by the time the world saw the police at their peak, the truth was already there, quietly growing beneath the surface. This wasn't just creative tension anymore. It was a standoff that had no easy ending. Number 4. Andy Summers. Andy Summers was different from the beginning, older, more experienced, and carrying a musical depth that neither of the others could ignore. Before the police ever found global success, Summers had already lived through the industry, seen its patterns, and understood how quickly momentum could disappear. He didn't chase attention. He refined sound. His guitar work wasn't loud or overwhelming. It was textured, deliberate, filled with subtle choices that gave the band its unique atmosphere. In many ways, he was the quiet architect behind what made the police feel sophisticated rather than chaotic. And yet that quiet presence came with its own kind of tension. Because while Summers was shaping the sound, Sting was shaping the identity. The songs, the lyrics, the direction, all of it increasingly centered around Sting's vision. And as that vision became clearer, so did the imbalance. Summers contributed ideas, textures, and musical complexity. But those contributions didn't always carry the same weight when decisions were made. It wasn't loud conflict, like the clashes with Stewart Copeland. It was quieter, more controlled, and in some ways more difficult to resolve. Because silence has a way of holding on to things longer than arguments do. In the studio, Summers would experiment, pushing the sound into unexpected places, adding layers that gave the music its signature depth. But not every idea stayed. Not every contribution survived the final decision. And over time, that created a growing sense of distance, one that didn't explode but slowly expanded. Interviews would later reveal what wasn't always visible at the time, a feeling of being present essential, even yet not fully heard. On stage, the chemistry remained undeniable. The three of them could still create something powerful together, something that felt complete, but behind that unity was a subtle shift. The balance that once defined them was no longer equal. And when balance fades, even the strongest structures begin to feel unstable. Summers didn't fight for control the way others did. He didn't raise his voice or force confrontation. But his silence carried meaning. It reflected a truth that was becoming harder to ignore, that in a band built on three distinct voices, one was beginning to stand above the others. And that kind of shift doesn't just change the music. It changes everything that surrounds it. Number 3. Miles Copeland, III. Miles Copeland III was not a musician standing under the lights, but his influence over the police was just as powerful as anyone on stage. Long before the band became a global name, Miles saw something others didn't, or perhaps weren't willing to risk. He believed in the potential, not just of the music, but of the image, the strategy, the way everything could be positioned to break through a crowded and unforgiving industry. He pushed relentlessly, booking shows, building momentum, shaping how the band would be seen before most people even knew who they were. Without him, there is a strong argument that the police might never have reached the heights they did. But belief, especially when it turns into control, can create its own kind of conflict. Because as the band grew, so did Miles's role in guiding its direction. He wasn't just managing logistics, he was influencing decisions, steering outcomes, and protecting what he saw as a carefully built machine. And at the center of that machine stood Sting, a man who valued independence just as much as success. Sting wasn't interested in being part of a system he couldn't shape himself. He wanted control over the music, the message, and the path forward. At first, that difference in perspective stayed beneath the surface. After all, the results were undeniable. The band was rising, the audience was growing, and everything seemed to be working. But success has a way of amplifying what already exists. Small disagreements about direction became more significant. Decisions about tours, promotion, and long-term strategy began to carry more weight. And in those moments, the question became harder to ignore who was really in control. Miles operated with strategy, always thinking ahead, always protecting the bigger picture. Sting operated with instinct and vision, focused on the integrity of the music itself. Neither approach was wrong, but they weren't always compatible. And as both men became more certain of their role, the space for compromise grew smaller. The tension didn't explode into open conflict the way it sometimes did within the band, but it lingered, shaping decisions in ways that weren't always visible to the outside world. Because not all power struggles happen in front of an audience. Some take place quietly behind closed doors, where influence matters just as much as talent. And in the story of The Police, that quiet struggle played a larger role than most people ever realized. Number 2. Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton was never officially part of The Police, and yet his presence hovered over Sting in a way that was impossible to ignore. By the time Sting began stepping beyond the identity of the band, moving into a solo career that demanded to be taken seriously, Clapton was already something else entirely, a standard, a measure of credibility, a musician whose legacy had been built slowly, deliberately, through decades of reinvention and respect. And that kind of presence creates pressure, whether it is spoken or not. Because when an artist like Sting begins to evolve to explore jazz influences world music and more complex arrangements, the comparison becomes inevitable. Not because they were the same, but because they represented different paths toward the same idea, artistic legitimacy. Clapton's approach was rooted in tradition and blues, in a style that audiences immediately recognized as authentic. Sting's approach was different, more layered, more intellectual, sometimes less accessible. And while there was mutual respect between them, the contrast created a quiet tension that followed Sting into every new chapter of his career. Collaborations, shared stages, and industry circles brought them into proximity where the differences became even more visible. Clapton didn't need to prove anything. His place had already been secured. Sting, on the other hand, was still defining his. And in that space, every decision mattered. Every new direction carried risk. Because stepping away from the success of a band like The Police meant leaving behind certainty and entering a world where comparison could shape perception. It wasn't a rivalry in the traditional sense. There were no public clashes, no direct confrontations. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist. Some of the most powerful conflicts are internal, shaped by the presence of others who represent what you are not. Clapton became that figure, not an enemy, but a mirror. A reminder of a different way to be accepted, a different way to be understood. And for Sting, that meant constantly asking a difficult question. Was he being true to himself, or was he being measured against a standard he never intended to follow? That tension didn't break him, but it followed him, quietly shaping the choices that would define the next phase of his career. Number 1. Sting himself. In the end, the most difficult conflict Sting ever faced was not with a bandmate, a manager, or a legend. It was with himself. Because everything that made him exceptional was also what made his path so complicated. From the very beginning, Sting was driven by something deeper than success. He wasn't satisfied with simply being part of a moment. He wanted to understand it, shape it, and when necessary, move beyond it. That kind of mindset doesn't rest easily. It questions everything. It pushes forward even when standing still would be safer. And over time, that internal pressure began to affect everything around him. Within The Police, his need for control, for clarity, for direction helped create some of the most memorable music of the era. But it also created distance. Because not everyone sees growth the same way. Not everyone wants to change at the same pace. And when one person continues to move forward without hesitation, others are left with a choice: follow, resist, or step away. Sting rarely stepped back. That was both his strength and his burden. As his career expanded beyond the band, the same pattern continued. He explored new sounds, new ideas, new influences, refusing to remain in one place for too long. But with each step forward came a new question, one that never fully disappeared. Was the pursuit of something greater worth what it left behind? Relationships shifted. Collaborations became more complex. Expectations grew heavier. And through it all, Sting remained consistent in one way: he trusted his own instincts above everything else. That trust gave him longevity, relevance, and a body of work that refused to fade with time. But it also meant carrying the weight of every decision alone. Because when you are the one setting the direction, there is no one else to blame when things change. In the end, the story of Sting is not just about the people who stood beside him or against him. It is about a man who never stopped evolving, even when that evolution came at a cost. And perhaps that is the quiet truth behind it all. The greatest battles are not always visible. Sometimes they are fought in silence, long after the music has stopped. In the years that followed, Sting didn't fade into the past the way so many others did. He didn't become a memory tied to a single era, replayed only through nostalgia. Instead, he endured quietly, consistently, and always on his own terms. The voice remained unmistakable, the presence just as controlled. But if you listen closely, there is something more beneath the surface now. A sense of distance, of understanding, of someone who has already faced the storms that once threatened to define him. The conflicts with Stewart Copeland, Andy Summers, Miles Copeland III, and even the silent comparison to Eric Clapton, they didn't disappear. They became part of the story, part of the weight that shaped every decision, every note, every step forward. Because in the end, success was never just about reaching the top. It was about surviving everything it took to get there. And for Sting, survival meant more than staying relevant. It meant staying true to a vision that was never easy, never simple, and never shared without resistance. The band may have fractured, the relationships may have changed, but the music remained, carrying with it the echoes of every argument, every disagreement, every moment where something could have fallen apart but didn't. And maybe that's why it still resonates. Not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. Because behind every song, there was tension. Behind every performance, there was history. And behind the man himself, there was a story that never fully revealed itself all at once. Now looking back, it becomes clearer. This was never just a career. It was a series of battles, some loud, some quiet, all necessary. And through it all, one thing never changed. Sting kept moving forward. Not because it was easy, but because he didn't know how to do anything else.